when talking to someone in an older generation about racism, sexism, xenophobia, etc., I think a lot of the disagreement is not about values, but about the definitions of these words. So normally, when I talk to, let's say, an older relative, they have in mind something like interpersonal bigotry or discrimination in the letter of the law. But what I have in mind is something more like any policy or interaction that maintains or exacerbates the inequality between the races or sexes, etc. So really anything that promotes or sustains inequality. And this is Ibram X. Kendi's definition that he really popularized. And well, we have to realize that this is an extremely vital perspective shift, in that it allows us to focus on policies that on the face of it are race neutral, but actually are completely racist in that they disproportionately or disparately affect the races. So an easy example is right after slavery was ended, vagrancy laws were instituted, which essentially criminalized homelessness and being unemployed, and that forced all of the slaves who were just freed into essentially indentured servitude or slavery by another name. And a more modern example would be something like the double burden of poverty. So, a poor Black person is more likely to be surrounded by higher levels of poverty than a poor white person, which means not only are they poor, but also whenever you aggregate resources at the community level, those institutions tend to be underfunded. And this is especially noticeable in something like policy funding education through local property tax. This means that schools will be underfunded even at the same income level for a poor Black person, poor white person, just because your neighbors also tend to be poor. So I think this shift in perspective is extremely important, but it also comes with a lot of nuances that we need to unpack. So one of those that I wanted to talk about was that these can come kind of, the immediate impact and long-term impact are not always the same. So if we consider, for example, an older relative that I have, and this is maybe a contentious issue at the moment, may argue for protecting hate speech. And in the past, I've been very quick to label this racist because it promotes an environment that is conducive to racism. But putting aside the intent, the impact, even in the long term, is hard to actually assess whether it's going to be racist or not. So obviously, Donald Trump's rhetoric has caused a huge increase in the rise of xenophobia and racism. And maybe that's one spot where we really can and should restrict hate speech, especially when it's coming from the president of the United States. But free speech, which is generally hard to protect when you make hate speech laws, because it depends on who's in power, how those laws will be implemented. Free speech has been necessary to even fight racism, and we're seeing this come up right now, where conservatives are trying to ban even the teaching of critical race theory in classes. And the definition of critical race theory in these laws isn't really clear, and it's become, a free speech issue for the left. So all this to say that the immediate implications are extremely important to pay attention to, but the long-term implications and impact are also really important to pay attention to. And if as I have in the past, we use the term racism to mean just disparate impact, which is an extremely vital perspective, we have to be careful that we don't trivialize anything and take off the table any policy that has any immediate disproportionate impact, because the long-term implications may be getting rid of some liberal value like free speech, which is actually vital for a lot of things, including maintaining a functional society in touch with reality, and also necessary for preventing long-term racism. So there are a few other examples here we really could talk about in terms of racism. I think these are also really difficult to discuss in detail, but there is the thing we have to be careful here is the kind of reactionary tendency to immediately label something with a disproportionate impact as negative. So as I mentioned before, the Black communities tend to be disproportionately concentrated in their poverty levels, which means that when you fund education through local property tax, education will be underfunded. This means that with education underfunded, you might expect to see lower levels of test performance for a number of different metrics on standardized tests. Then the question here that conservatives and liberals often debate is, is the test inherently racist, or is this something that indicates we have to fix the educational system? And I think what people on the right, and maybe correctly, tend to argue against is lowering the bar or abolishing the value of any underlying difference just because there is a difference. So for example, just saying, well, the test is unimportant and educational attainment is unimportant because there is a disparity in educational attainment. When we flatten our value hierarchy, instead of identifying the underlying cause of the inequality, that could be labeled a postmodern tendency and also doesn't help anyone involved. That said, at the same time, given the legacy of historical discrimination in this country, especially in education, we obviously need to examine whether explicit discrimination is the underlying cause itself for the discrepancy. And next, I kind of wanted to talk about, since a lot of this podcast is going to touch on critical theory, not just critical race theory, but really the origins of critical theory and the implications of critical theory in general, I want to talk about what is critical theory and what do I see as being the value in it. A lot of this podcast, we criticize it, but I think there's immense value in it, and I want to make sure that that is clear before we even start the discussion. So just a quick framing on critical theory. In my view, postmodernism came first, and that's the philosophy that there is no objectivity, there's no objective truth in really anything, and so people making objective claims to truth are doing so generally for power. Critical theory builds off of this and says, analyzes history in terms of oppressor and oppressed, and Marxism can be seen as one instance of critical theory in terms of economics, but really it chronologically came before critical theory and inspired a lot of it. Critical theory grew out of the need, and largely at the Frankfurt School, to explain why communist revolutions hadn't come to pass all over the world as they had in the Soviet Union. And Marx thought that communism was inevitable, so wages would keep dropping, capitalism was unstable and would eventually decline. And the philosophical question of the day was, well, why hasn't that happened, and why haven't there been widespread communist revolutions, and why haven't they taken place everywhere? So to answer this, critical theory really turned to ideas like ideological oppression, or the hegemonic culture. So what that means is that there's some societal beliefs that get buy-in from the oppressed people themselves in their own oppression. So I keep coming back to this quote from Marx, and that quote is, "Your jurisprudence is nothing but the will." Well, it's something like this. It's your jurisprudence is nothing but the will of your classmate into law for all. When you take this and apply it to other forms of oppression, what you get is, your values, your societal values, are nothing but the will of the oppressor made into values for all. So critical theory looks for these subtle forms of oppression in society and tries to subvert them. One instance you could argue is local property tax. I also think of the book The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which talks about racist beauty standards that exist in society. But really, critical theory tries to re-examine all of history and all knowledge in terms of oppressor and oppressed, and in terms of power dynamics. And we talk a little bit in the podcast about how this can go in some areas that are more objective, like science. This doesn't quite make sense, but it also does in the sociology of science. So for instance, in Nazi Germany, you wouldn't have a Jew investigating, are Jews inferior? But obviously all of the Nazi scientists were investigating the claim, are Jews inferior? So obviously the questions science asks can be themselves influenced by power dynamics that exist in society and can exacerbate the inequality and oppression that exists in society. One quick thing to note here is that although there's a lot of Marxist analysis that inspired critical theory, I want to differentiate this from cultural Marxism, which has historically been an anti-Semitic claim, also relating to the Frankfurt School, stemming from Nazi propaganda that was basically saying there's a Jewish liberal gay agenda trying to take over and tear down the system. So what we're talking here is not cultural Marxism. It is critical theory, and there are some connections that might be concerning with respect to Marxism, but it is not this, claim that there is a cabal of Jews and leftists trying to tear down the very society. So specifically, critical theory tends to go after claims of objectivity, and it's not just a reinspection of history in terms of power dynamics. It has actual political claims and agendas, and this isn't my reading of it. It's in the critical theory textbook by, I want to say, Richard Delgado and or two authors, Gene Stefanek, I think. And critical theory's agenda, targets objectivity with the postmodernist element, liberalism, and capitalism. And it argues generally for race-based policy as opposed to colorblind policy. So now here's kind of where I'm going to get a little bit away from the facts and talk about my opinions of critical theory. So I mentioned the double burden of poverty, where you aggregate resources in concentrated areas of poverty at the local level, and that exacerbates issues for everyone in that community. And that creates a double burden of poverty that is especially harmful in Black communities. So my thinking here is that critical theory is vital for picking up on this difference. But when you find that problem in society due to the concentration of poverty, it makes sense to fix that area for everyone. That issue for everyone. You're not going to, it doesn't make sense to fix that just for Black communities, but not fix it for poor Latino communities or Latinx communities or poor white communities. So I think it makes a lot of sense to make sure the solution to the problems identified by critical theory are still in line as much as they can be with our liberal values, and that will allow us to solve the underlying issue. And critical theory, although maybe this isn't explicitly from critical theory, does exist to some extent in our legal system at the moment. So disparate impact theory, for instance, is a legal doctrine that, as far as I understand it, and I understand it at a superficial level, is essentially saying that whenever there's a disparate impact on one race, you have to justify that disparate impact, or you have to get rid of it. So it's not just it is itself tackling superficially race neutral policies and examining them for racist impact themselves. So although this isn't actually a spin out of critical theory, I think it's completely in line with critical theory and makes a lot of sense to codify in our legal system. So it's saying whenever there is a disparate impact, if there's not a great reason for having that disparate impact, even though it's superficially race neutral, it is racist in its impact and it should be abolished. So, why is critical theory becoming so popular at the moment? Well, one reason is that there are huge racial disparities in society. And we need to find answers for why these disparities exist so that we can fix them. The far right, tends to, go to biological determinism and can very quickly result in the extreme explicit racism that exists. Whereas critical theory is tasked with finding answers that don't blame the oppressed group themselves. Some people, there was a book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva, called Racism Without Racists. And the idea here is that culturally, explicit racism and racism in the letter of the law is no longer acceptable. And our task as a society is to explain, okay, well, now how can we explain these huge differences and disparities that exist in society without resorting to answers that blame oppressed people for their own oppression? And critical theory is really the process of uncovering that answer. And what it looks for is subtle ways that race-neutral policy and race-neutral values in society are actually going to cause a disproportionate impact, and so using our new definition of racism, a racist impact. As my conservative relatives, point out, if it's all just due to bigotry, then why are Jews who face, I was actually surprised by this fact, Jews do face like the most hate crimes, according to the FBI statistics of hate crimes, proportionate to their population of any ethnicity or religion. And so, or at least that was true in 2018. And so my older relatives will say, well, if Jews, are facing so disproportionately so much explicit bigotry, why are they doing so well in this country? Can't everyone? And the answer is, like, there is a history and current politics that disproportionately affects some groups and not other groups, and critical theory is what is needed to uncover that and to fix that. I think that this question is extremely important to investigate, and critical theory does a really good job of investigating it. But I do want to stress again that the stakes of the liberal solution, where possible, can be dramatic. So I read Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I found a lot of great points in there and really good value in reading the book. I think everyone should read it. But some of the things at the extreme that kind of are implicated by the assertions and stated by Kendi himself, I think are, maybe not in line with a liberal solution. So Kendi has talked about actually instituting, I don't remember if it was in the book or I think it was in an article afterwards, talked about instituting a Department of Anti-Racism. That sounds reasonable, but he basically suggests making any statistical difference, so any disparity between the races above a certain threshold, like making that illegal. And anything that exacerbates that would be illegal. And the article really suggested that this government agency would have control over Congress, which I think, might be a problematic violation of the separation of powers in our government, and kind of pushing us, the solution, in the wrong direction. At the other extreme, though, without the critical theory lens, what you get is no need to address anything but poverty due to just historical discrimination and historical explicit discrimination. So conservatives like to frame the question as, do you think current inequality is the result of historical oppression that causes excess poverty? Or do you think it's due to current bigotry and explicit discriminatory institutions? And if you think the second one, like that's the way they conceptualize the claims that critical theory and critical race theory are making. But I don't think, and their answer is that it's the former, it's all this historical oppression, and there isn't really current bigotry in their minds. I think there is current bigotry, but that's, the structural or institutional or systemic racism is the bigger problem. And so this is a false juxtaposition. There are some people on the left who think this way, who think that, all of the current disparities are due to explicit and overwhelming bigotry. And I think they misinterpret the claim systemic racism to mean that there's a widespread explicit bigotry in the country. And I don't think that's the claim that the left is actually making or should be making. In reality, I think it makes sense to frame the question more like this. Given the past historical explicit discrimination, in the Black community against women, what laws and policies affect people differently, maybe in subtle ways, that promote or maintain inequality, and how can we fix them? And I think this is fixed both in terms of the underlying cause. So, in the example of the double burden of poverty, this would be maybe removing local property tax, or rather fixing disparate concentrations of poverty in the country. That might fix the underlying issue. And then maybe one level up from that, we could apply a fix at the level of just getting rid of local property tax, because that seems like a totally reasonable thing that we could do without. As you move up and up the chain of where you make your intervention, kind of the causal chain, I think it becomes less tenable. So at the very top, if we say, like, we are going to give everyone in the country, this is, going to the very top, we're going to distribute resources equivalently, we do wind up at some form of Marxism. So I think where you make this intervention matters a lot. And if you want a liberal fix, really tackling the underlying cause is probably the best way in most cases to do it. And then we can move up as feasible as possible. And that's kind of will entail liberal solutions. And here by liberal, I don't mean left. I mean really the philosophical definition of liberalism, which argues for, civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, individual rights, democracy. I think what people on the left sometimes miss is that in this discussion is that a lot of statistical differences are not always caused by the subtle institutional policies and can be explained by the historical discrimination causing inequality of resources. And so the question is, given this historical discrimination, not just what policies have disparate impacts, but we exist in a world, in a really capitalist system, that given the historical discrimination, it takes a while and maybe never in depending on your level of capitalism for this distribution to re-equalize. And then the question is, how do we fix the underlying cause when the cause itself is something like the system or capitalism as we know it? And this is a really difficult question, but I think it's really hard to use the new definition here and just say the new definition of racism, the impact-based definition I talked about, and just call the system that we have regulated capitalism, or really anything short of communism, just label that as institutionally racist, because it does maintain the status quo. But in reality, if we just get rid of a regulated capitalist system in favor of something like communism, then that's going to be worse for everyone, right? Again, the long-term impact here will be a lot worse than the immediate impact is. So the question is, how do we fix this? And can we fix it without just labeling the entire system racist, irredeemably or inherently racist, according to the new definition, which may be technically correct, but may be counterproductive in the long term. So I guess the trick is really maintaining our liberalism, while also redistributing wealth for everyone to the extent that we can, and fixing the subtle differences that critical theory picks up and identifies due to disparate impacts of policy, given the historical discrimination that has occurred, and put people in different starting points. I also do want to mention that right now there's this huge debate about critical race theory in schools. We're really not going to go into that. But I do want to just mention that kind of the voices on the right label everything as critical race theory and use it as a way to demonize everything that they, as a catch-all for everything they don't like ideologically on the left, or maybe even don't understand. And well, the response on the left has been, well, critical race theory really just refers to graduate studies, and a couple of scholars like, Kimberly Crenshaw or Derek Bell, and so it has nothing to do with what is being taught in schools. I also don't really agree with that, because, well, there are downstream implications and explicit policy agendas, and those can be taught without really understanding the original texts, and have come to give us a lens through which to view problems. But that can be taught as the truth and one perspective, and we should have that lens and solutions that look like solutions from critical theory. Or we can have critical theory solutions be one perspective among others, including liberal perspectives and solutions. So I think as long as we're not teaching that one set of solutions is the truth, then I don't really think any of this discussion matters that much. And to what extent this is happening in schools, I have no clue. So in summary, what I really want to emphasize here is these definitions are tricky, and we'll try and do our best to get them right. I think critical theory lens with liberal solutions is what will work in the long term. I'm open to hearing otherwise, and I hope this podcast will move the discussion forward.